All right, I think we're going to get started here, given that we want to actually leave some time here at the end for some questions and get people to lunch. So appreciate everybody coming in to attend this session on developing decision support tools for changing landscapes. My name is John Turpak. I'm the science coordinator for the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks Landscape Conservation Cooperative out of Lafayette, Louisiana. And I'm here just kind of helping keep Andrew and Thomas in line today in terms of keeping them from rambling on past their 20-minute allotment. So anyway, I think this is a really exciting topic. I think this is a good direction of where LCCs are really headed. And these are some of the first LCCs to really get out in front of the kind of conceptual models about thinking about that landscape change and integrating the priorities across trust resources. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Andrew Milliken, who's the coordinator of the North Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative.
Great. Well, thank you, John, for the introduction, and thanks for moderating and keeping my ramblings under control, which you'll see may be a bit of a challenge. But and thank you all for attending this session on what I hope you will agree is a really foundational topic for landscape conservation cooperatives, and that is understanding the impact of changing landscapes on natural resources and how we can use that information to guide conservation decisions. So today I'm going to talk about a project that's now underway in the North Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative, designing sustainable landscapes for wildlife, that is being undertaken by a team at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, being led by Dr. Kevin McGarrigle, and also associated with a number of other key partners and partnerships in the Northeast. But before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge a couple of key foundational efforts that are completed or underway that have been important for us to build upon. And the first of those is a project known as the Designing Sustainable Landscapes for Bird Project that was conceived and developed by the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture working with North Carolina State and Auburn universities as well as USGS, with the initial efforts being undertaken in the South Atlantic Coastal Plain, which is that area shown in blue on the map. This Designing Sustainable Landscapes effort had a very similar set of objectives and overall approach and methodology, and so the North Atlantic team has really learned from and built upon this effort, and ultimately what we hope to do is actually link consistently across landscapes to this effort. The second foundational piece I wanted to mention is really the commitment by partners in the Northeast to develop regionally consistent spatial data, and particularly some of the spatial, regionally consistent habitat mapping that's been done in the Northeast by the Nature Conservancy, by the Northeast States, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and more recently the LCC. This foundational, regionally consistent spatial data is critical for the type of modeling that we're doing. So the general vision for landscape conservation cooperatives, that is the conservation of landscapes that sustain natural and cultural resources, clearly faces many challenges associated with human activity, notably a lot of direct impacts to habitats like habitat loss and fragmentation, and all those impacts that are now magnified by accelerated climate change. So clearly solutions to address these challenges, which are becoming more serious and more complex, will require multi-scale approaches that integrate complex, multivariate spatial data and anticipate future changes. And clearly dealing with these complex challenges and particularly trying to anticipate future changes really requires that we take a modeling approach. And really one of the ways that we think about this project is a modeling framework to guide conservation decisions within our landscape conservation cooperative. So really this project is about developing a modeling framework to help meet this purpose, which is to assess the capability of current and potential future landscapes in the North Atlantic LCC to provide both integral ecosystems and suitable habitat for wildlife, and to provide guidance for strategic habitat conservation decisions based on this information. The first phase of this project is focused on 3 pilot study areas in the North Atlantic LCC. Those are the ones shown on this map here. So you can break that overall purpose into 3 components of the project, and that is understanding landscape changes, and then being able to assess the capability of both current and now potential future landscapes to provide both integral ecosystems and suitable habitat, and then using that information to design landscapes and guide conservation decision making. So these components put together, landscape change, assessment, and design, make up the key components of this, what we call the LCAD model. And this is really the simple version of this modeling framework. And I'm going to talk about each of the components here, but very briefly, and I'll make a note that at the end I'll provide a link to a website that has a lot of detail on each of these components if you're interested in the detailed methodology models or approaches. So let me start by talking about the landscape change component. This is really focused on what we call a set of ecological settings. This is basically a database of spatial data that includes both this consistent habitat map that I mentioned earlier, which is developed by the Northeast States and the Nature Conservancy in the Northeast, and that uses an ecological systems classification developed by NatureServe. This is one of the key foundational parts of this project. And then on top of that, a whole set of ecological settings data, which are spatial data layers that include a broad but parsimonious suite of biophysical variables representing the natural and anthropogenic environment at each location or cell at each time step. So by parsimonious, we mean that we try to select the minimum number of variables that can best represent the conditions at each location and at each time step. And I'll make a note that for this project, the scale that we're working at is 30-meter grid cells across the entire region. So then acting on these ecological settings or the spatial data is a set of drivers. And this set of drivers can include a lot of the different things that are happening. The two that we've chosen to focus on in this first phase are climate change and urban growth, although you could add a lot of other things into this category. And for each of those drivers, there's a set of scenarios that are really user-defined, such as a variety of climate change scenarios that we can choose that help us get at some of the uncertainty that in future predictions. And I also want to make a note that these drivers then act upon the ecological settings and interact with the disturbance and succession models to give you an idea of what future landscapes are going to look like. So the two major drivers, again, the first is climate change, and so in this project, they downscaled climate models from the global circulation models down ultimately to the 800-meter grid, and then further resampled to the 30-meter grid cells to be consistent with our other spatial data. And so this particular graphic shows the projected average minimum temperature in January from 2000 to 2080 under two different climate change scenarios. And you can see by watching the animation here that both the magnitude of change and the difference between the two scenarios is most dramatic later on in this sequence. And that's, I think, pretty important in terms of thinking about when climate change is really going to kick in terms of having major impacts relative to other drivers. So another major driver is the urban growth scenario, and the UMass team put together a multi-stage statistical model that includes user-defined scenarios to vary the total amount and sprawliness of growth relative to historical patterns. So again, users can define different scenarios, then you can run these different scenarios over time. On the left is the baseline growth based on historic patterns, and that's about a 1% growth rate. On the right is about double that rate. You can see the great increase in urban growth or developed conditions across the landscape in those two scenarios. So then you can put these drivers together with the disturbance and succession modeling and get a simulation basically of future conditions or a stochastic dynamic landscape change simulation. And you run that simulation many times, many repetitions with multiple different scenarios to address uncertainty. And so this particular sequence is showing the change in biomass and change in urban growth over time from 2000 to 2080. So then this landscape change model is applied to this landscape assessment of impacts of landscape change. But before I get into a description of that, I want to point out just at the top here that this whole set of landscape change models actually also feeds into a parallel project that's going on through the USGS and the University of Massachusetts to look at the impacts of landscape change, particularly urban growth and climate change on hydrology and temperature and the impacts on fish populations. So that's a separate but linked project that's going on. So what I'm going to focus now on is the landscape assessment part of this model, which we've chosen to do sort of a two-part approach. One is a fine filter and one is a coarse filter. And the coarse filter is based on the concept of ecological integrity applied to the suite of ecological systems, that ecological systems map that I showed. And in this particular project, ecological integrity refers to the capability of an area to sustain ecological functions over the long term, and especially in the face of disturbance and stress. And it's a relative measure from low ecological integrity up to high relative ecological integrity. So for the purposes of this project, an integral landscape is one that has green infrastructure containing a diversity of connected ecosystems with high intactness, resiliency, and adaptive capacity. So each of these indices shown here can be assessed individually, or they can be assessed collectively through a composite index of ecological integrity that gives you a sense of how all these things fit together on the landscape. And each of these indices is actually informed by a set of metrics, weighted metrics, and spatial analyses. So for example, the resiliency index includes 3 metrics, including this one, which is the connectedness metric, how well connected is the landscape. And in all these maps I'm going to show, blue is sort of the high ecological integrity, red is the low ecological integrity. So you can see the areas that have good local connectivity, and most of these slides are in the Massachusetts focal area that I'm showing here. But then you can also look at the composite network, or composite index of ecological integrity, so you can see again where the areas of high overall ecological integrity are within this landscape. And then you can compare that at different time steps. In this case, I'll compare ecological integrity under current conditions with ecological integrity under the lower level of urban growth and climate change scenarios. So even those lower levels, you see some pretty dramatic changes in ecological integrity from 2010 to 2080. And by comparing these two, then you can actually get an assessment of the impact. And this slide actually shows you the areas that are most impacted by both climate change and urban growth in this area, where the ecological integrity is most impacted. So the areas shown in red here are the areas where ecological integrity is predicted to be most impacted in the future. So you can imagine how this type of information is going to be really useful for conservation decision making. So the other part of this two-part approach to understanding landscape assessment is the fine filtered approach. And in this case, we do it by looking at the concept of climate and habitat capability applied to a set of representative species. And in this project, habitat capability refers to the ability of the environment to provide local resources such as food and cover needed for survival and reproduction in sufficient quantity, quality, and accessibility to meet the life history requirements of individuals and local populations. And this model is developed using a set of representative species. And the way this was done was that for each ecological system in our consistent habitat classification system or grouping of ecological systems, we identified a suite of priority species. And within that suite of priority species, we identified a representative species, or in some cases, a number of representative species whose habitat needs, ecosystem function, or management responses were similar to the group of other species. And therefore, the conservation planning for those representative species and conservation actions for those representative species should bring along those other species in the group. This, of course, is an assumption that needs to continually be tested, and this does not assume that all species are covered by this approach, particularly those that are rare or have unique habitat needs. So, importantly, in this process, we decided to basically disassemble or pull apart two different approaches to looking at the climate and habitat suitability for each of these species. In other words, we did not feel like we had sufficient information to understand how climate was going to affect ecological systems and therefore the habitats needed by these species. So we didn't really feel like we had enough information on how how these ecological systems are going to move or disassemble or reassemble in unique ways such that we could actually predict the impact of those changes on species. So we basically decoupled the habitat model from the climate model, and you'll see that we actually put those back together at the end here. So this is the habitat model part of it, and this is a habitat capability model. It's kind of a habitat suitability model with a few other factors thrown in, and it ranges from 0 to 1, and this map shows the suitability with the most suitable areas shown in blue on a relative scale. You can also threshold this and look at the most important areas, in this case where the home range capability for this species, the Blackburnian warbler, is greater than 0.5. And again, this is the kind of thing that's useful for conservation planning. But then you can start to look at future predictions. In this case, we can look at urban growth and the impact on Blackburnian warbler priority habitat. And you can see, even under the more modest urban growth scenario, we lose 85% of the Blackburnian warbler habitat in this landscape. So a pretty dramatic change. So the other part of this modeling effort for species and habitats is the climate part, and this is based on a climate suitability model, which is a statistical model that basically uses presence and absence data in a humid temperate domain and develops a model based on that. And what you're seeing is the humid temperate, or the climate model for the Blackburnian warbler in the eastern United States, and we can zoom in on the area in Massachusetts, and in this case, actually, red is good and blue is bad, but the most suitable areas here are the red areas, but this shows you the relative value of climate suitability for this species in this landscape. So again, you can use a threshold approach and say, what part of this landscape captures 95% of the occurrences? Where is the climate envelope where 95% of the occurrences of this species are? And this basically gives you the climate niche envelope for this species in this landscape. So now you can take predictions of climate change in this area and see how that affects the climate envelope in this area. So under the more modest climate change scenario, you can see there's a pretty dramatic reduction in the climate envelope for this species in this landscape. And under the more dramatic A2 scenario, you can see there's an even greater reduction of climate suitable area within this, or the climate envelope within this landscape. So now what we can do is actually put these two approaches together and say, okay, this is the occupied or the most suitable habitat within this landscape under current conditions, under current climate. So this is the area now that has both habitat and climate that are suitable for this species. And then you can look at the effect of climate change on this. And what you see is that there are now two zones. One is the zone of persistence, this area in the northwest corner, where you have both persistent future habitat for that species and persistent or climate that's suitable for that species within the species' current range. And then you also then have this area of zone of contraction where the suitable habitat might still be there, but the suitable climate or the climate envelope is no longer there. Now, this does not necessarily mean that the species won't occur in these areas outside of the climate envelope. What it means is that there's a higher probability that it will persist in this area where the habitat and climate are both suitable. So that, among other things, this is pretty useful for vulnerability assessments, and I think, yeah, there's a number down here where we actually said that you can give an index of vulnerability. In this case, about 80, it's 0.82 or 82% of its habitat or climate suitable habitat will disappear. And of course, for species at the northern end of the range, the opposite can occur. You can actually have the climate envelope increasing so that the area that includes both suitable climate envelope and suitable habitat will increase. So that's the zone of expansion shown in blue on this map. So we can do this for a whole range of representative species, and we've done it for about 15 different species, several of which are pictured here. So the final part of this model is actually applying this information to developing landscape designs and guiding conservation decisions. And really important here is that particularly this part of the effort is that users and managers are at the table from the beginning in these discussions about what decisions they're making and what information they need to make those conservation decisions in this landscape. So we've begun those conversations, we've begun those interactions with users and managers, and we're presenting them this range of tools that they can use. We're modifying and outputs and developing tools that are most useful for them. And I'll just present a few examples that we've been talking about with our partners. These are fairly simple examples, but there's an almost endless iteration of outputs and approaches that we could use depending on what decisions are being made and what decision support is needed. So this is an example of prioritizing land for protection, and in this case you can look at this current conditions of ecological integrity and identify the most important areas. So you can threshold that and look at the areas where the top 30% of ecological integrity occurs, and that might be one of the things you look at relative to land protection. But you can also look at some of the individual metrics like connectivity. Oh, I'm sorry, before I get to that, the other thing is you can now look at the impact of future conditions, and in this case we've overlaid urban growth on these high priority areas, and the areas that show up in this kind of mustard color are areas that have high ecological integrity that are likely to be most impacted by climate change, and therefore these are areas that are both high priority and high threat. So those are areas you might want to prioritize your conservation actions. We can also bring in individual metrics like local connectivity to help guide our conservation decisions. And then we can contrast or compare this ecological integrity model with this species habitat-based model. And in this case, the priority habitat for black Berneian warbler in this landscape overlays very nicely with the high priority ecological integrity areas. So really doing actions based on ecological integrity or based on a black Berneian warbler species habitat approach would guide you to the same thing. There may be other species like wood thrush that have different or broader habitat requirements, and in this case, you could see how you would then use this information to complement both ecological integrity and species habitat, and you might think about best management of practices you would do in those additional areas, for example. And then you could do things like overlay existing protected lands to identify gaps in data. So this is just an example of a landscape design in which we could vary the tools that we put into it, and we can also layer in things like rare species occurrences and other tools and important geographic areas that our partners, like our state partners, are already using, so they can think about their role in these conservation designs. Another thing that our partners in the LCC have really been asking for is give us an understanding of how my local conservation action or my local site fits into the regional context and fits into this assessment of future conditions. And I'm not really going to run through these, but these are just a few questions that we're going to try to answer through various assessments and uses of this landscape change and design model. So I think in the interest of time I won't read through these, but it really gets at vulnerability and regional context and allowing managers and users to understand how they fit in. And then there's lots of examples of kind of restoration, and building off this morning's talk, restoration from the perspective of restoring or increasing resiliency, I guess is the way I'd put it. Not restoring back to historic conditions, but restoring conditions or ecological functions that will allow landscapes to be more resilient. And this particular example is prioritizing locations for road passage to improve terrestrial connectivity and improve resiliency to climate change. So the first phase of the project is winding up, and the next phase, which is going to start right away, hopefully, is an expansion of this approach from those 3 pilot areas to the entire Northeast region. So not just the North Atlantic LCC, but the entire Northeast region where a lot of our state partners work. And then the development of additional drivers, and at a minimum that's going to include incorporating sea level rise modeling and hopefully forest management as another key driver here. And then a real effort to continue to work with users and managers on the development of decision support tools, and the integration of a number of other approaches. Some of you may be familiar with the resiliency approach or conserving the stage approach of the Nature Conservancy. We're working very closely to integrate their work into this model, and that will be included in the second phase. And then the rest of this is really all about disseminating, working with partners, communicating, outreach, which are all really critical steps. I really just skimmed over the surface, so there's lots more information at this website, the UMass website, that you can get all the modeling information on any of the details, methodology, or I'd be glad to answer your questions or provide you the information, or feel free to contact the principal investigator, Kevin McGarrigle. And while I leave this slide up for a second, there's something I forgot to mention when I showed the Designing Sustainable Landscapes for Birds in the South Atlantic, and that is that the South Atlantic LCC and the Southeast Climate Science Center are actually using the results of that Designing Sustainable Landscapes work in the Southeast to help guide and develop their conservation blueprint. And there's a couple staff here from the South Atlantic LCC, and so when we get to the discussion, there's an opportunity to ask them how they're using this type of results in their LCC to develop a blueprint and guide conservation decisions. So with that, I'm done with the formal presentation part.
Well, that's good. Thanks, Andrew. I know that was really data-rich and information thick, and we're just going to try to hold questions, though, to the end, so we have an opportunity to get both kind of perspectives in play here. And so with that, I'm going to just introduce quickly Thomas Eason, Deputy Director for the Division of Habitat and Species Conservation with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I always forget what all those C's stand for.
A lot of C's in there. Good morning, everybody. I encourage you to come in if you don't want to stand. There are seats up front. No one likes to be in the front row, but if you don't want to stand, there's plenty of room. You won't disturb us. Come on in and find a seat. While we're letting people get settled, I just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity to talk. I feel like we're kind of on high with this halo behind us, so I think it's going to hurt some of my slides, but it feels good to be backlit and feel very important up here. And I also wanted to say, similar to Andrew's talk, we kind of conspired back and forth. I decided to take the tact of a lot of information in a short amount of time. So I'm going to try to weave it all together in a story, go quick but not talk too fast. And it reminded me, I took a ruminant animal nutrition course as a graduate student, not being in any of that and all this physiology, and we were just having like 4 classes a week and 50 pages of notes every class. So I went to the professor's office and said, why are you throwing so much information at us? And he's like, well, this is the way I figure it. If I cut it way back and presented 100% of what I wanted you all to know, you'd learn about 50% of it. So I throw 1,000% at you, and if you only get 10% of it, it's a lot more than if I only did a little bit. So that's the tact I'm taking. I don't know how it's going to work, but I'm going to dive in. So I normally do a bunch of intros and tying things together. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to dive into a lot of the exciting things that we have happening here, or not here, but in Florida, that I'm just a part of. This is not my agency doing a lot of this work. It's not me, but it's exciting to be a part in seeing all this great work going on. So first note to know from Florida, there are a ton of really good ecological, spatially based analyses that we've had since the late 80s. And so the challenge in Florida is, how do you pull all these together? How do you line them up and get them pulling in the same direction and not inadvertently competing with each other? So I'm going to go through the ones that you see up here with an emphasis on Florida 2060 and some of the more recent MIT scenario planning. So 1,000 Friends of Florida is a good nonprofit NGO in Florida. They've been very proactive, and they sponsored and pulled together what we call the Florida 2060 report. This happened back in 2005, so it's a little bit dated now, but they wanted to look at trend analysis of where Florida is now, retrospectively looking at development patterns for people over the previous 30 years, and then project that out. And again, obviously from their perspective, wanting to put pressure on the policy situation in Florida. And so they took a moderate population growth. They didn't even take the most aggressive population growths that were accepted for Florida. And then they went through some scenarios and some assumptions. Basically, the take-home message here is they did their best to model the previous 30 years of development in Florida and then multiply that out or project that out over the next 50 years. And again, you don't have to be a statistical genius to figure out when you double the number of people in the state of Florida, there's going to be a lot of impacts to the landscape. So I'm not going to belabor the point, but again, this is the moderate population. This is not the aggressive population, human population for Florida. Staggering amounts of human change going on. And so they showed this is what Florida looked like in 2005, red being developed areas, green being conservation, and then that yellow color being where it's ag or natural or in some other state. And then you project out to 2060 and you can see it's a pretty dramatic change for particularly central and south parts of Florida. And again, so that's where Florida keeps developing as we have in the previous 30 years. That's what our state is going to look like in 2060. And no one likes this scenario, not even the developers we talked to. So it was a pretty strong push to get people really thinking actively about what do we want Florida to look like. So a little bit more of the data you can see on the left is 2005, on the right projected 2060. There are about 38 million acres in Florida, and you can see that a lot of that is going into urban development in the 2060, and it's coming out of ag and undeveloped lands. So if you then blow up those new acres that are moving into development, a lot of it's coming from agriculture, a lot of it's coming from native habitat, and then a pretty good hunk coming from other sources. So again, if you're for the Fish and Wildlife Commission like I am, that's some pretty staggering numbers to think about, that much habitat loss in Florida. And so one of the things that came out of this is my agency said, well, what might this mean for fish and wildlife? We kept talking about it, and it was about humans and where development might occur, and there were all these assumptions that people made, but there was no real rigorous attempt to go in and say, what might that mean for fish and wildlife? So this is all speculative, but again, we took the great Florida 2060 work, teed it up around wildlife, and then we have some pretty good publications, and just pulled a little data points out of here. I'm a bear biologist, so we just are in the process of writing a bear management plan where we want to conserve lots of Florida, and boom, right off 2.3 million acres of black bear habitat, not impacted but under concrete, so that's pretty significant. Same thing for turkeys. Gopher tortoises, our current goal is to increase gopher tortoise conservation areas by 600,000 acres, and here we're projecting we're going to lose 700,000 acres. And again, just to put it into perspective, we're talking about an area larger than the state of Vermont is the potential impact in Florida. And just putting it in very simple terms like that helps people wrap their minds around it. So we also looked at some of our wildlife management areas. This is Babcock Webb. It's about 65,000 acres in green. You can see as you start overlaying this potential development that you become ringed by habitats that aren't very conducive to burning and doing other things on the landscape. Other interesting side notes here is you can see that there are areas that are connected up. There was a big 80,000 acre conservation project in that area. So even in this very human-dominated landscape, Florida is being very proactive and working to connect up as best we can within these restrictions or these coming changes. We also took a quick look at coastal challenges, trying to ease into maybe talking about climate change in a very conservative state. And the take-home message here from the 2060 work is, in 2060, there's projected to be about 26 million people that live in the coastal counties of Florida. And Florida, as you can see, is highly vulnerable to sea level rise. What happens to local economies? What happens to fish and wildlife? What happens to people when you start getting sea level rise? And so again, the take-home message that we were trying to get at is we can do a lot of good work getting prepared for this, but let's engage and let's start talking to each other. Another outgrowth that was happening around these times that was influenced heavily by the 2060 work is what we call CLIP, or the Critical Lands and Waters Identification Project. And this was it's not going to look like it up here, but a staggering undertaking where Florida literally has 15 to 20 different statewide ecological assessments of important areas for wildlife, for water, for ecological connectivity. And CLIP, working through our Florida Natural Areas Inventory and University of Florida GeoPlan Center, got all the experts together and arm wrestled it out and came up with a single model that takes into account all of those statewide data. And so again, just to give you a feel for the structure, biodiversity, landscape, surface water, all currently are being combined into a single model, and then we're continuing to work on groundwater and marine issues. And any one of these smaller boxes underneath there represent long-standing, peer-reviewed scientific work that I could spend my full 20 minutes on talking about any one of those boxes. So these experts went through, figured out how they fit together, decision rules, got everyone to come to consensus about how we combine all these data together. And so this is what you end up with. This is actually data. We now have CLIP 2.0. Things keep moving faster and faster, but this is CLIP 1.0. And you can see that the kind of brick red are existing conservation areas, and then the darker and lighter green are the highest two priorities of 5 priorities within the CLIP work. And you can see that there's a lot of connectivity and landscape built into there, also a lot of fish and wildlife priorities and water priorities. The idea is if we can all work from a common technical underlaying, then we can all work together on this. And again, I could go into lots of detail, but one interesting thing that came out of this, it allowed us to start looking at, okay, let's look at agricultural lands in Florida that are the highest of the high priorities for fish and wildlife. So the red you see up here are silvicultural or forestry lands, and the red you see is agriculture. And so again, it didn't take a statistical analysis to tell us you need to go start talking to these landowners that are working in the landscapes and their current practices, even though we historically have vilified it and said it's not good for fish and wildlife. These people are the ones that are sustaining the important landscapes in Florida with their current activities. And so we have worked hard in Florida to reach out to the landowners and agriculture and silviculture and embed them in our discussions from the beginning. I'm going to shift gears into talking more about climate change and landscape change from a human population perspective. MIT has done a lot of excellent work in Florida, partnered with the Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS early on. This is all work by Juan Carlos Vargas and Michael Flaxman. They graciously allowed me to present some of their findings. And again, we could spend a long time going into the approach, but one of the things they wanted me to stress here was it's that a very intensive stakeholder-based participatory planning from the beginning, and then that all goes into very data-rich, data-driven, heavy manipulation on the computer side, and then what comes out are a bunch of landscape scale tools that help you envision what might happen. And again, they focused on human population change, basically the regulatory and planning environment, climate change, and then strategies, different ways to try to piece all that together. And so the original study area were the southern 35 counties of Florida, because they were focused on Everglades restoration, and that's where the funding was coming from. Since then, we've expanded this work to statewide, and we're excited to get the full data online soon. And again, I can't go through all of the scenarios, but they basically took the IPCC scenarios and then looked at a bunch of different things: sea level rise, temperature increase, precipitation, and then you also have human population, land use and water planning, and then financial resources. So the easiest way to think about this is with this little diagram here in 4 dimensions. You have human population either being, static, slightly increasing, or increasing. You then have monetary resources going towards conservation, and then you have basically business as usual or proactive conservation, and then you have climate change being high, medium, or low, and all those different factors. And so with that background, they then say, so why do we want to do this? And again, this seems very simple, but it has been helpful in Florida just to walk through some of these examples. So we have species X, and you fast forward 100 years, and their habitat is going to migrate northward in all sorts of different directions. And so if you have a current protected area that's hitting most of what that species needs, and you move into 100 years from now, they're completely outside of that protected area. And so then what does that mean? Because simultaneously as that species range is shifting, agriculture is shifting, housing, human response to sea level rise is all shifting, and if you don't get out in front of it, you end up with only the ability to conserve kind of a quarter of what that species might need. And so MIT has helped everyone visualize there are a couple of steps that we would want to do to be proactive. One step would be to let's get out in front, identify these areas, and put conservation on the map first before we hit ag and other things, or at least do it in conjunction with that. And an intermediate, more immediate step is there needs to be some kind of stepping stone, or what they call a climate corridor, to allow that species to move into that new area. And so ideally, if we did it correctly, we would have conservation at least in the mix as equally strong as everything else, and ideally kind of laying the groundwork and then having agriculture and housing working around that in ways that work for fish and wildlife and for people. And so all of this goes into a very complex modeling process that I'm not going to go into, and then just realize that all this is based on hundreds of people working together, providing the input on the scenarios. They ran 5 different full scenarios and as many as 20 or 30 setting all this up. And so what you get, and based on the different scenarios, whether you have high conservation value or development first, their computer gets in there and starts parceling out based on all these assumptions and modeling data where different pieces are going to go. And so right now it's showing you development first, then conservation, then agriculture, and then you can see how the landscape might look after that, with the dark green being conservation and light green being previous conservation. And so the computer, just as Andrew said, churns through millions of these, and then will spit out different scenarios. And again, these are very dynamic, and these are snapshots of them. But you can see scenario C with high sea level rise, low financial resources, and business as usual. It looks very similar to the Florida 2060. And then on the right, you have lower sea level rise, high financial resources, proactive, and a trend population. And you can see that there's the potential to have a lot more conservation and a more functional integrated landscape there. So again, kind of getting back to basics, I don't know if this is going to show up well with the light, but you basically, thinking from an ecological landscape perspective, one strategy is to hit the critical corridors first, and then come in with interior habitat that connects that up and bolsters it, and then identify new and additional important habitat patches, and then identify where potentially urban growth might occur and or other conflicts, and then identify where those are, and then one strategy would be to focus on these potential conflict areas first, or fairly early in that order of trying to conserve the landscape. And so I wanted to walk through just again some of their different results that they're coming out with. So under a proactive conservation network approach, one, you would start with structural corridors. Some of these, 2 kilometers wide, are fairly arbitrary, but based on public or expert input, you would start there and then move into, let's create the interior habitat corridors, and then move into additional patches. And again, all of this is based on the CLIP data and all of these very integrated databases. And that's what the full picture could look like for kind of South Florida. And then you lay over top of that these pink areas, which show, similar to what Andrew was showing, this is where human response to sea level rise and just development in general is going to be eyeballing the same high priority areas as the fish and wildlife and natural resources are. And so again, this is just going to be a little bit of a time lapse, but you can see year 2010 under these 2 different scenarios, and then you fast forward to 2020. You can start seeing some pretty dramatic differences as you move through time, depending on what trajectory Florida ends up being on. And you can see some pretty significant differences in how much is conserved versus in development. And so this is just looking at the basic difference of new development versus conservation. And the interesting thing is, if you're proactive and you can do it in a very human-focused way, but scenario B accommodates all of the same amount of human population growth and other factors as just doing it in a much more dense and coordinated manner. But tremendous orders of magnitude difference in what you can do on the landscape. And so just to kind of wind this down, we then took all of this work plus others, and we just turned in a major revision to our wildlife action plan, turned it in October, and one of the main new things we did was we have an entire chapter focused on climate change, and it built off of a lot of this work that I've talked about. And so one aspect of that, not all of it, but to keep the theme of the MIT work going, we worked with them and used 3 of their 5 scenarios, looked at 6 representative species. You're seeing the crocodile here under different scenarios, and then you can see sea level rise is going to have a dramatic impact on crocodile habitat in Florida. And again, this is all based on expert input, scientific data up front prior to doing any of the modeling. And what you see for the crocodile is all of their habitat, these little light blue areas, this is their old habitat, completely inundated under moderate to higher level sea level rise scenarios. And then the experts were predicting that it's not just going to be a static, the habitat goes away, but the mangroves are going to migrate, and so then you have kind of primary, secondary, and tertiary range shifts. But again, pretty dramatic impacts to what could happen to the crocodile. And then, so based on those 6 species and some others, we looked at 3 general kind of types of responses to sea level rise with Fish and Wildlife in Florida. One, the crocodile is a good representative of room to move. There's, South Florida is heavily conserved under public ownership, and there's a lot of room for them to maneuver inland. And then another one, competing with the neighbors. The panther was a good example of that. Even though their habitat will not be heavily impacted, maybe 15 to 20%, it's going to push them northward into a lot of prime areas where people are also most likely going to be settling. So a lot of competition for becoming more scarce resources. And then surrounded on all sides, we had a couple of species where they've got sea level rise on one side, they've got Miami on the other, and that's very challenging to try to figure out what to do when there's no possibility of naturally connecting them up into other areas. And then just kind of to finish with a little bit of a teaser, along with all of this other work, we have been working to include the human dimensions, the social science part of this, and this is very challenging for folks like me that are ecologically oriented, but we found very early in Florida that you can do all of the ecological great modeling and work you want, and if you don't connect with the landowners, if you don't connect with the people, if you don't connect with the government, it's not going to lead anywhere. So we've been working on what we call the Cooperative Conservation Blueprint for 5 years now, and it's starting to build momentum. And the whole idea is if we can all collectively, from agriculture to local governments to NGOs and state government, federal government, if we can all envision and agree on the landscape that we want to see in the future, we can create that through a million different ways and do that focused on people and focused on incentives. And then that brings me kind of full circle to why I'm here, why Florida is heavily invested in the LCCs and very excited about this, is there's a whole range of resources from the local all the way out to the international level, and we feel strongly that the LCCs are almost the perfect platform to look for local, private, state, federal integration across these very complex issues to where you can, I think, create success around some very challenging conservation issues that are out there. So with that, I will wrap it up, and thanks for your attention, and John, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Thomas. That's for both Thomas and Andrew. And what we want to do in the last 10 minutes here is really not just take some specific questions about what we've just heard, but also think about the potential application of these types of approaches across the LCC network. If other folks in other LCCs can comment about kind of what they're doing, or folks that are partners about the utility of these kinds of approaches, that would really be welcome. So if you just raise your hand if you have a question or a comment, identify yourself, and then identify who you're going to address your question to. Dennis?
Dennis Fig from the Center State of Missouri. I have great questions for both of you, but Tom's will have to go over drinks.
I guess that means me.
The species assembly that you laid out, and I love it, and I lived it, and that was a big driver for a comprehensive wildlife strategy in Missouri, which was a multi-tax species assemblage group that represented biodiversity conservation.
Right.
As we move into revision, I'm asking myself and my community, do we need to revisit that list, those assemblages, aggressively, or just be good with them, or rethink the whole thing? And part of it is because we're trying to be climate informed. I am real uncertain about that assemblage now, because that assemblage you pick then guides the models. and then the thinking that you have, and it's almost like that assemblage needs to be climate informed. And I don't exactly know how to tackle the assemblage. I mean, know the process. I don't have to be informed on that. So are you still feeling good about the assemblages you have? How do you wrestle with that in a climate-influenced world?
Well, that's a great question, and because our representative species process is fairly recent, we actually did incorporate climate into the selection of representative species. So the main criteria was how well that species could represent that group, but we also factored in whether there are species that could help us track or understand climate vulnerability. Whether we did that in the best way or not, it was really a user, expert-driven approach to that. But what I think ultimately is that this is going to be an iterative process, and I showed you how you can use the climate and habitat models to actually do vulnerability assessments, and I think that will allow us to continue to refine our list and add to our list of species that we're modeling to best represent kind of the full range of vulnerability in our landscapes. I think that's the way we're thinking about it. Does that answer your question?
I'm not comfortable yet, but yes, that's a great answer.
Okay, and I guess the other thing is that we're not comfortable using only a species habitat approach. We really want to look at ecological integrity. We want to look at the geophysical factors. We want to look at rare species locations. We really want to factor in all those things into our assessments.
Right. If I could then connect this to LCCs, my recommendation to Landscape Conservation Cooperatives is to really move toward the species assemblage thing, to have agreement on species assemblages, preferably by ECRs or ecological units. And when you do that, I mean, everybody immediately brings their federal trust species, their stateless species, and the focus immediately becomes on these other things, and it is the wrong focus. The focus that you can all move forward with is a species assemblage, even though it's imperfect, that's ecologically sound, that the LCC gets, that you create together. And your priority federalist species may or may not be on a species assemblage, because it may or may not be the thing that informs you about your future. Absolutely, that's how LCC should be approaching this, what are our priority species.
And Dennis, just to cut in there, that's where I think the state wildlife action plans have a good role to play. The species of greatest conservation need, a little bit more holistic and looking at that. So I'm excited to see if we can continue to maneuver multiple programs together.
And I'll just build off that, and that is in the Northeast, then we're actually providing some of this regional information which will feed into all 13 state wildlife action plans. So we're helping provide the regional information to provide regional context within each state wildlife action plan. So it's a really nice link there.
Yes.
I'm Sarah Bickerman with Defenders of Wildlife in Oregon, and Tom, the question is for you. So the politics have shifted in Florida a little bit.
Just a little bit.
How has that affected your ability to use this wonderful information for land use decisions, particularly those that the state has implemented?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what perspective or what layer you're talking about. For us personally, it hasn't changed anything other than we're just not out there proclaiming it from the rooftops. It's all going. It's actually, we're picking up momentum and speed, and there's a lot of really good work where it's getting embedded in the groundwork. Like CLIP was brand new two years ago, and it's already, we're not having to mandate it from anywhere. People are using it because it's really good data. So yes, we don't talk about climate change in Florida a whole lot, and we have to be aware of that. But other than big issues, like our Florida Forever, our $300 million land acquisition program is basically on life support, big issues like that. But from the planning tools and getting them embedded, it's actually an opportunity to kind of go underground and get the roots and the trunk set, and then I think it'll all sprout when we have a better environment above ground. So, David may be able to answer more there.
Add to that, Fish and Wildlife Service out of Jacksonville, we work a lot with Thomas and the crew over there in Tallahassee, and it has changed the dynamic a bit. What it hasn't done is it hasn't fractured any of the relationships that we have with a lot of the stakeholders. Thomas referenced stakeholders, and that's something that I don't think can be emphasized enough. The work they've done over the last decade, in particular, the investment they've made, stakeholder input into the state wildlife action plans and a lot of their management decisions, has established credibility that isn't going to switch bit of an election from one election to the next, and I think that's, if something holds it together, I think that's going to do it.
And then just one last comment on the private landowners, has actually helped us not pushing climate change so much and not trying to be quite as exuberant that way, because it really turns off some heavy hitters. And so kind of being a little bit more reserved and really talking about what it might mean for them, it's helped us do what Dave just talked about and build trust and get in there and start working with some important
The state
folks.
director there is pushing very hard for working landscapes. We know that's a key if you look back at some of those maps and the overlay with silviculture and agriculture. That's critical, and keeping those lines of communication open, making sure you maintain your credibility there and looking for the tools that you can use, working with those individuals is crucial.
For both of you, do you have decision frameworks that you can plug these tools into? And if so, what are they? If not, why not? Do you want them, so the...
The short answer is no. The longer answer is yes, but there are a lot of them, and they're not always clearly articulated and or understood. And again, I think that's a really good role for the LCCs to help pull out where those decision networks are already in place, and we just haven't thought about them and articulated them and create ones that move across. But the short answer is no, there's no one-stop shopping in Florida for how to do this. I mean, the slide that they showed earlier with hundreds of entities, that's where we are in Florida. And so it's hard to try to get everyone using the same data, much less agreeing on how to use it and where to put it.
And the answer for our project is that it's underway, and we're right now we've been focusing mostly on the conservation community, which is really probably the easy part, and the LCC role in guiding that conversation, and also on specific decisions like the interaction of sea level rise and piping plover populations and the decisions associated with that. But in terms of an overall decision framework for this broad set of changes, it's really a work in progress at this point.
I think it's be a good point to actually look for the South Atlantic LCC, because I think you guys have incorporated some of those decision frameworks in your blueprint.
No, I'm not even sure exactly what you mean by that, so let me just make a comment. I'm Ken McDermott, I'm the coordinator for the South Atlantic, and we've got David Keister over here as our geospatial analyst. But I just want to make a comment that I think especially what's going on in North Atlantic, very similar approach across the LCC, future change, setting our conservation targets, trying to figure out what do we need across the landscape to get there. That's the approach we're taking. Dennis, the representative species approach that they work on the same thing. That's what our goal is, was make sure to get that part. We have a framework in place, and we're building the science gaps, filling the science gaps we need to basically answer all those questions. We need more information on aquatic species, or whatever the gaps are, build that model. Very similar, not exactly the same, and I think that's okay. We're trying to get to the same place. We're trying a few different approaches, but it's fundamentally the same thing across the geography, incorporating future change. What do we want? And developing a working conservation blueprint, to use a term that's interactive and living, that allows us to answer the questions from policy level to land management level to everywhere in between about how you can, what are the decisions you need to make to support those conservation goals.
Yeah, I think, and I started after Thanksgiving, so I'm still getting a handle of a lot of it that's already been done. But it's very similar. One of the potential differences is that we start with conservation actions up front. And so thinking of what type of conservation actions can we put on the ground to influence these changes. And then the kind of machinery that we've built, the model that we've built, incorporates that and helps us strategize where on the landscape for this particular conservation action should I take it in a certain year in order to achieve that result for the representative species for our ecological integrity. So that's a little bit different, I think, than the North Atlantic, but again, it's very similar the way we're going about things. And we also were started with the Designing Sustainable Landscapes project that American Joint Venture started as kind of our starting point.
And I just want to add one comment to that, and that is, in both of these projects, one of the terms that got used at some point was this idea of an optimal conservation strategy. Is there this solution that meets all the needs? And we've really backed away from that in the sense that we really think what we're really developing is a set of toolkits to help or a set of tools in a toolkit to help us make decisions about conservation outcomes that meet multiple needs, but we don't feel like there's sort of this optimal conservation strategy we're working towards. It's more a set of tools and a blueprint that we're working towards.
I don't want to cut the discussion short, but we are out of time for the session. So if you have a burning question you want to hear answered, raise your hand, but wait against holding everybody else up for lunch. Is there any other questions out there? Yes.
So you mentioned I'm Janine Salas, with the Institute for Natural Resources in Oregon. We're doing landscape assessment in the west, and looking at MC1 climate models for different emission scenarios. So I'm just wondering, it seems like there's an opportunity to look at trends under these different approaches. So are you planning to look at what are the outcomes of habitat and vegetation using different approaches to emission scenarios?
Well, if I understand your question, then, so not only looking at 10 years, I mean, what we're doing now is certain time steps, but what you're saying is actually put a trend line on that?
Yeah, and just different modeling approaches.
Yeah.
What I understand is different climate models are good at different things. So there's a climate
Yeah.
model really good for vegetation outputs, there's a climate model really good for hydrologic outputs.
Right.
And how do you figure out which model to use and how to integrate them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a really good thing to do, and one of the ways to think about the project we're doing is, at its core, it's a modeling framework that you could plug in a different climate model downscaling into. There's no reason you couldn't do that. Yeah. Yep. Right, thank you.
Thanks again, everybody.
Wish we had more time for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. I forgot everything I was going to say at the front end, so.
Thanks for moderating. Hey, Laura. Thanks.
I'm just wondering what direction if
Well, first of all, we don't lump agriculture and urban growth is urban growth and human. It sort of grows into